This week on Snark Squad Pod, we are joined by Connor O'Brien and Sarah Lewis to talk about The Northern Lights, also known as The Golden Compass, by Philip Pullman. Welcome back to Snark Squad Pod. I'm Nicole Sweeney.
My name is Marines, and this week we are joined by Connor and Sarah.
Hey, what's up, you guys? This is Connor, and I have a YouTube channel where I primarily talk about books.
And I am Sarah, and I am a consumer of media.
the one and only qualification around here. We like to consume things. And this week we are talking about one of Nicole's all-time favorite books, The Golden Compass. This story takes place in a world similar to our world, but not our world. Here, human souls exist outside of their bodies as talking animals called demons. Our main character is Lila Belacqua, and she believes herself to be an orphan being raised at Jordan College in Oxford. At the start of the story, Lyra and her demon Pantalaimon are in the college snooping around when they witness a plot to poison her uncle, Lord Asriel, who occasionally comes to visit the college and who has returned once again. She warns her uncle not to drink the poison wine and then has to hide while her uncle presents to the other scholars. During his presentation, he talks about dust, elementary particles that are attracted to adults and that also hide a parallel universe in the Northern Lights. The scholars agreed to fund his continued research into dust. At the same time, children are going missing in Oxford and the surrounding cities, kidnapped by a mysterious group of people called gobblers. Lyra's friend Roger goes missing and she wants to save him, but she is temporarily distracted when she is adopted by a woman named Miss Coulter. Before Lyra leaves Jordan, the master of the college secretly entrusts her with a device called an alethiometer. It's a symbol reader which can be used to learn the truth about anything. Lyra finds that she can instinctively read the very complicated and precious device. After some time with Mrs. Coulter, she becomes ill at ease, and this is cemented when Mrs. Coulter's demon attacks Pantalaimon. Lyra also learns that she is the head of the gobblers and that the gobblers are being funded by the church. Lyra and Pan run away and end up with Egyptians. There she learns that many of their children have also gone missing, and the Mrs. Coulter and Lord Asriel are actually Lyra's mom and dad. Lord Asriel has been captured and is being held in the north, in the land of the armored bears, because also armored bears are a thing in the story. The Egyptians mount an expedition to find their missing children. They pick up a mercenary armored bear named Yorick, a balloon-flying Texan named Lee Scoresby, and form an alliance with a witch clan along the way. During the trip north, Lyra is directed by the alethiometer to a town with an abandoned child whose demon has been severed from him, leaving the child disoriented until he eventually dies. Soon after, Lyra is kidnapped once again, and this time she's taken to Bolvangar, where the gobblers are cutting away demons from kidnapped children. Lyra forms a plan to escape, but is caught and taken to be severed from Pan, but Mrs. Coulter arrives in time to stop it. Lyra manages to escape and lead the other children to escape, just as Yorick, the Egyptians, and the witches arrive to help save them. Serafina Pekkala and her clan of witches fly Lee Scoresby, Lyra, Roger, and Yorick north in order to save her father. They crash land in the north, and Lyra is separated from the group, and she is captured yet again. She tricks the Super King into fighting Yorick, and Yorick is successful and assumes his place as rightful king. They find Lord Asriel, who has continued his own research on dust and knows that it has spawned parallel universes and that it is somehow connected to death, and that the church thinks that dust is the basis of sin. Asriel's plan is to destroy the source of dust, but he needs a large source of energy in order to travel to a parallel universe. To do so, he severs Roger from his demon, killing Roger and tearing a hole in the sky, stepping through it on the way to his plan. Lyra is devastated by the betrayal and determined to now stop her father. She also steps into the parallel universe, and that is how we end our story.
Yeah. So there's a lot.
just a little bit.
So normally the place where we begin is whether or not we all liked this thing as like that sort of baseline. And I'm going to get to that. But I think maybe slightly more useful baseline for this is just like everyone's experience with this, just because this isn't a new piece of media. This is a children's book that was published more than 20 years ago. So I think it's maybe useful to have some sense of what everyone's relationship with this book is before we start. So Connor, I'm going to start with you. What is your background? What is your experience with this book?
I've always really wanted to read the series, but it's always been one that always got pushed like further and further down the road. So I actually read The Golden Compass for the first time a couple of weeks ago. And that was like my first exposure to the actual book. I'd watched the movie when it had first come out, so I'd had that little bit of background going in. But yeah, this is the first time that I've read the book, and I think that I'm the only one that hasn't read past the first book that's here right now.
Yes, I believe so.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Is that your warning to not spoil you on the other books?
No, you can spoil me on the other books. I'm not too concerned about it because I've heard from a lot of people that the first one is the best one, and then the rest of the series starts to go downhill after that. So I'm not too worried about it.
That's one opinion that's to have. So Sarah, I'm curious about your background too. So Sarah, we found Sarah as our guest on Twitter sort of randomly, and it's like, I feel very serendipitous and beautiful. So what is your background and experience with this book?
So I read this book for the first time in 5th grade, which is now quite a while ago. And I've reread it a number of times since then. I reread it most recently just last year. So things might be a little bit hazy, but I've also got it right in front of me just in case I need to reference anything.
So actual childhood experience with this children's book.
Yes.
I know this book. Well, I first knew about this book as one of Nicole's favorites. I have very strong memories tied to it being a favorite of Nicole. One of them is a video that you made on YouTube years ago, I guess, talking about specifically the last one, I think, and some themes in the last one. And I think that video was probably a product of this other memory that I have. And it's you and I in Paris. And we were actually on a bus from Paris, and where were we going?
Mont Saint-Michel. Yeah.
And we were going to Mont Saint-Michel, and I didn't bring a book, which I was kicking myself over because it's a 4-hour drive. And you were happily reading. I don't even think it was the Golden Compass. It might have been the Amber Spyglass, or I don't know.
One of them.
But I just one of them, yes. And it was a worn out paperback copy, and you were so happy reading it compared to my I don't have anything. I don't know. That memory really sticks out to me. The feelings associated to it, and I think pretty soon after we came back from that trip, I picked up the Golden Compass. That was
because of jealousy. Because of jealousy,
essentially. Remember when I didn't have a book? Well, now I have a book. So I read it for the first time. Then I picked it back up for a second read in 2016. So this is my third time reading this first book, though I've only read through the series one time complete.
So I first read the books right after I graduated from college. So as an adult, although I don't know, I definitely would not have described myself as an adult at this point in time in my life. I was, living with my parents and whatever. But I think I first heard about the books because of the movie coming out. The movie came out when I was in college, and I had a friend who had been obsessed with the books. And I remember he was super, super excited to go see the movie. I think he went to go see it by himself because he was like, no, I need to have this experience. I've been waiting for this since I was a little kid. I don't really remember what his reaction was. I'll have to ask him after this. I'm curious how he felt at that moment in time. But so I read the books right after college. And there are some themes and things in the third book in particular that at that very particular moment in my life felt like I found words for things that I had always felt and believed in some sort of abstract way. But then there they were on the page. There were words for these feelings. I fell in love with the book for all sorts of reasons in this first one, fell in love with the characters and whatnot. But that third book and that experience of seeing my thoughts and feelings put into words that I had never had before was a thing that cemented the series and my feelings in a very deep and permanent kind of way. So that is my background with the books. This is interesting because I think we kind of revealed where we're going with this next one, but it is basically the only segment we have to the closest thing we have to a segment. So, did you like this book, Connor? I guess you're the only one who didn't reveal the answer to this question. So, Connor, did you like this book?
Yeah. So I actually had mixed feelings about it, which is so weird because I love middle grade, and this is targeted as a middle grade book, although I would probably bump it up a little bit more than that. But I I liked it. I had a good time while reading it. And then the ending, because I was not expecting that to happen. I was not expecting Roger to actually end up being killed. I was like devastated. So I can't tell, and I haven't rated it anywhere, and I haven't really talked about it too much. I can't tell if I'm just being really sensitive and annoyed by that. Like, I don't know. I'm like all over the place. I have so many different conflicting emotions because it's a good story and it's well written, but I'm still bitter. So I don't know what I want to say. Like, I really liked it. I thought that it was really really fun. I really liked how Lyra was going on this adventure. I liked the witches especially, but I don't know. One of the things that I hate the most is when parents are like villains, and literally her parents are the worst things in this book. So yeah, I had mixed feelings.
Very interesting. Sarah, did you like this book?
No, I just hate read it a couple of times. So, no. I really enjoyed it. Back when I was in 5th grade, I think it would have been out. The last book would have just been coming out around the time that I was reading the first one. So I went through and I read them all right away. And I really enjoy them. They are, if anyone ever asks, oh, what's your favorite book? It's always this series. So I would say, yes, I do enjoy them quite a bit.
I did enjoy it. I think that it's really funny because we picked this also as our first group buddy read that we're kind of putting together more efficiently with the SnarkSquad in the Discord. And so as people were preparing to pick it up, I was warning everyone hey guys, it's really slow. Give it some time in the beginning. It's really slow. And I don't know if I said that so many times that it became not true, or if the experience of rereading it now for a couple of times has changed how I view it, and it has become so familiar that I didn't feel that at all, but I didn't feel that at all. And I loved it the first time that I read it, specifically for some of the characters, but there were still some things that I was able to pick and say, okay, these were kind of my the weaker parts of the story to me. But all of that, time 3, I guess, is where all of that has been erased, and I'm just I love it. I love it. And I like I said, I've only read the entire series one time. I am one of those people that thinks the first one is the best one. And I do love the same themes that come up in book 3. Book 2, I really, really kind of struggled through, even though, again, some of the characters are my favorite. So I'm very curious to continue on with my reading experience to see if this is something overall that's going to continue growing in my feelings. But yeah, I love it.
It's worth noting to this point of how it flows through the series is that I'm pretty sure this was written as a single entity, but you can't publish children's books that are 1,000 pages long. That's just, you just can't do that. So that is part of why it was split up into a trilogy. I believe that that's true. I feel I don't know, maybe I just read this a long time ago and it's just living in my feelings as a thing that's a fact, but it's not. Whatever. I already said that I love this. It just, hit at the right time. I don't know. I think we talk about that periodically on the podcast, that the mood that you're in when you consume a piece of media has a really strong impact on your relationship with it. And that is something that is just super subjective and personal, but is always going to be part of your experience with a piece of media. And so for me, it's just been that experience of it being this thing that I returned to year after year throughout my 20s. And in addition to all the pieces of the story, there are all these little pieces of my sense of self, that are littered throughout it because it's this thing that I reread over and over again. And I am not a big reconsumer of media, but this is one of the few things that I do turn back to over and over again. So the obvious place to begin is with dear sweet Lyra Silvertongue. That moment where Yorick renames her is one of, I was going to say one of my favorites. I don't know. I'm going to say that a lot of times. I'm just going to keep saying that. That's one of my favorite moments. This is one of my many favorite moments. My heart just swells. So Lyra, how did we all feel about Lyra? What were your sort of early reactions? Did that change at all over the course of the book?
I think that for me, my first read, I I found it a little difficult because first portion of the story was a little slower to me. I found it difficult to invest feelings into Lyra, and looking back at past me, I don't know how I could have been so wrong because I love her so much. And I think that, you know, apart, this is a joke, but totally objectively, she is literally like one of the best female protagonists that I've ever read. I think that she is complex. I think that she has flaws. I think that she is brave. I think that she carries the story in a lot of ways because of who she is as a character. I think that, when you talk about young children who are protagonists, you get into this tricky area where people start talking about how believable they are, which is, so subjective in terms of like what kind of children what kind of child you were. But there's something about how she is precocious and brave that felt believable to me. And so it was easy to really invest feelings into her. For all that this book has very dark themes and is heartbreaking at times, the thing that I think keeps it in balance is Lyra as a character and the way that I view her and the way that my feelings are invested into her. I just think, I love her so much, and I love that she's a little bit of a liar and a storyteller, and I love the way that we view some of the characters through her lens at points, and just the ideas of like good adults and bad adults are kind of divided by her and how she reacts and treats with all of them. So yeah, I'm a big time Lyra fan.
I would agree. I don't remember how I felt originally reading the book, but I know that at least for my thoughts now on her, I agree wholeheartedly that she's a great character. She's very lovable. She's definitely someone that you sit and root for the whole way through. I like that she's a very strong character, but she's also flawed in a lot of ways, because she can be very bullheaded, and she can, she does lie and try and trick her way through things. And sometimes it doesn't always work out the best for her. But I think it's a character that you can't help but want her to succeed.
I think for me, it was one of those things. Well, I do remember how I first felt about her because I just read the book. At the very beginning, I did find her a little bit off-putting, but that was because of me. Like, that was totally my fault. And I think that that's something that you guys have experienced on rereads, that you're like, why did I think that I didn't like this character? She's amazing. And I think that I realized it midway through this first read, because at first I was like, oh my God, she's really frustrating. Just listen to people, like, do what you're supposed to. And I'm like, that's me as an adult being annoying, like as a kid I would have done the exact same things as her, and I love that she was a liar. I love that she makes up stories. I think that is like exactly how I was when I was a kid, and I think for her it makes a lot of sense because she hasn't been told a lot of the things about herself that normal people know, so she's making up stories about her father that she has no idea about. She's been lied to, so she just fabricates all of these extra stories to make herself seem more important or cooler or more popular or whatever. And I think that that's something that kids do. And I think that during the story, she was really consistently like that. Like, she continued to make up stories to fill in gaps in her knowledge or fill in gaps of like her made up story. And I loved it. I think she's great.
That's a really interesting point too about it being like, you can see exactly why she is this way. She's, been left so much to her own like intellectual devices, and, she's a child. And so it makes a ton of sense that then a lot of that is her filling in the gaps. I also love and adore Lyra. 100% would die for her. She's amazing. But I love that, as with most people, like, her strengths and weaknesses are often two sides of the same coin. She's like brave and courageous, but also that means she's constantly like bungling into shit and make it, and like doing the wrong thing because she's not thinking about it first. And, she's a liar, but also like she's super inventive, which is a whole other, I'm going to get to that later. I'm going to put a pin in that. We're going to revisit at a later point. But overall, yeah, I adore her. I think there's a couple really interesting moments where we see her relationship with the various adults that she's interacting with and her kind of sense of self. Mari mentioned earlier that this is our first sort of Snark Squad book club pick that we're doing in our Discord. And so we've been talking about this book all month over there. And you said something about how you can see a lot of like themes of childhood and coming of age in terms of like she's defining her sense of self through the adults that she wants to be like and doesn't want to be like. And there's this moment that I love where when she and Yorick are going to find Tony Macarios, and she's like terrified. All of the adults in this town are afraid to go see this little boy. They think he's some sort of evil spirit. And Lyra thinks to herself that Yorick said that he would like master his fear. So she's like, okay, I got to master my fear too. She's an 11-year-old little girl. And she's like, well, the armored bear is brave. So I guess I have to be brave too. And it's like, that's like peak Lyra at her best. So like, it is a thing that I love in terms of why I love Lyra, but it is also in terms of the larger themes of the book, really interesting as this moment of, she is a child trying to figure out who she is and who she's going to be. And like part of how she's doing that naturally, because she's a child, is by defining herself against the adults around her. And like the ones that she respects are the ones that she wants to emulate.
So I think that part of the reason that Lyra as a character kind of grows on you, apart from reading this as an adult, and having the natural like annoyances of adult looking at a child and the way that she's behaving and not having like a full worldview. But I think it gets so much better when she leaves Jordan and her world opens up a little bit. So you have Lyra in the context of a bigger world. In the context of Jordan, it is very, like Connor was mentioned, like she doesn't know much. She's not doing much. She's just running around left to her own devices. And so you kind of see her getting into like, trouble that doesn't mean anything. She's just, kind of moving things around and going into places that she it was told not to be. And it's all just kind of her entertaining herself. But when the world and the adventure opens up, she then seems different. And all of those characteristics that were annoying in a smaller sense become something else, right, in this adventure. And I think that has a lot to do with what, you're talking about, Nicole, and what we were talking about in the Discord of her like measuring herself up against the new people that she's exploring. And so the moment that I really remember being like, oh, I love Lyra is when she's with the Egyptians and she first gets brought to John Fa. And so he tells her like, tell me your story. And she's so awed by this man who seems, strong and like he's gentle, but he has all of this authority. So she's measuring herself up and she's deciding, okay, I want to tell the truth. I wanted to tell the truth to this man. Like I see who he is. He seems so honest. And she then decides that that's a quality she wants as well. So she's doing this constantly throughout the stories, like measuring herself against the people that she admires, the people that she trusts, and trying to be like them. And then as she's like spilling out the story in like a rapid stream to the Egyptians, I'm like, oh, I love her so much. I just love her. She's so precious. So I think that's interesting too about, like how she expands her world in that way.
You mentioned that she takes things from the people that she respects, but she also takes things from the people that she doesn't particularly like Miss Coulter. She admires how authoritative Miss Coulter is and how she gets things done with the way that she interacts with people. She really notices how her mother will like touch people's arms or will like, manipulate people or just like play off people's emotions to get what she wants to get done. And then she does that later on in the story to get what she wants done. So I thought that it was interesting that she definitely does take exactly like the aspects she wants from each adult in her life and like, brings it into herself as like a toolkit for herself.
Mm-hmm. Which is like the essence of coming of age. and this as her coming of age story. Yeah. Like that is exactly the thing. You also see a little bit of that too at the very end when she is in Azriel's prison mansion and she's admiring how she's thinking, I can't like him. I can't trust him, but I have to like admire and respect him, she's still awed by him in spite of the fact that all of her ideas about him have changed. And I think that's also just super interesting in terms of, the way that she is finding her sense of self. So speaking of all of the adults in this world, of which there are a great many, I was trying to think of like how to sort of go down the line of the various different adults and like what order, what sequencing makes sense, whatever. But I don't know if it makes sense. I'm just going to start with Yorick because I love him. And because while talking about Lord Asriel, something that comes to mind is how many times in the beginning of Lyra's interactions with Yorick, she is making comparisons between him and Asriel, because at that point in time, she still like thinks the world of him. She thinks he's the best. And, you know, she has that thought where there's a bit where she's thinking about how she has started to internalize the idea of Lord Asriel as father, but Mrs. Coulter is still just Mrs. Coulter because she hates her and loves him. But it's interesting because she like, you know, loves Yorick. And so she in her head is constantly trying to draw all these parallels between these two people. And I don't know, I just find that very, very interesting. And I love so many things about her interaction with Yorick. I think as much as I will say all of the parts of the books are my favorite, I think if I really had to pick sort of a specific favorite, it is just all of her interactions with Yorick and like the bits with the bears in particular. I think that's like a really interesting sequence of Lyra, you know, taking all of the things that she's learned and like all of the ways that she's grown and, you know, putting them into the full effect. I mean, obviously it is that because it's, you know, near the end of the book, for pacing reasons, that's the case. But I think it's just like a really like tense and also lovely and wonderful sequence. I don't know how to build that into a question. What does everybody think about what do you think of Yorick? Because I guess where I'm going. But
well, I guess I think also the first thing you did bring up that she does compare Yorick to Lord Asriel a lot, which I think is interesting because she had like these blinders on for Lord Asriel, and she thought that like because Lord Asriel and Yorick have very similar like backgrounds, like they were wealthy people that were like knocked down in society because of something that happened. Like Yorick ended up killing another bear, Lord Asriel ended up killing another man, and then they lost their status, lost their holdings, lost everything. But she still views Lord Asriel as like the success story. But then it ends up being like the reverse because like Yorick ends up being the one that saves her and like becomes the king of the bears and all that stuff. Is he king? I can't remember. But
yes,
and Lord Asriel is like the evil one that's terrible and kills her best friend. So like that is really interesting that they like flipped it on its head.
Yeah, very, you know, reality expectations, you know, of as a child, right? Like all the things that you think about the world and the moments of realizing that maybe your ideas about the world are wrong because you're a child.
I guess also like with Yorick, he is the only one that I guess fully values Lyra. Like he completely takes her side on whenever she voices an opinion. A lot of the Egyptians are like, oh, well, you're a kid and all this stuff. And yeah, they listen to her when she reads the alethiometer, but like they're hesitant to. Yorick is all in, especially because she helped him get back his armor and everything like that. So I think that that's one of the things that's super endearing about him, because you just can't help but love him because he respects her the most.
Yeah, that's totally true. This is something that we talked about a little bit in the Discord, is the idea that this book is so much about like the idea of childhood in a lot of different ways. And part of how you have a clear sense of the adults, like the adults are good or bad based in large part on how they treat children. Like their relationship to children is essentially what defines them as good or bad in the books by the end. And like that is a really interesting point, that like the Yorick more than any other adult just like trusts her, and like that is part of why he is so particularly endearing in this. Like, you know, we see a lot of other examples of adults being good to children, but I think that gets at something really fundamental about the experience of being a child, though, right? The rarity with which adults like see you as whole. I mean, I literally made multiple "because you're a child" jokes already in the, you know, half an hour we've been recording, right? So like, you know, this is a thing. This is like a real and true thing. And part of what makes Yorick so great is that very fact that he trusts her and treats her as an equal.
I've been trying to put this thought together because I had it and then it went to a bad place, and now I'm trying to bring it back around. There's this like trope of like the unemotional person, like their affection being more like significant to earn. And I think it plays out in a very bad way a lot of times in romance, where it's like the cold-hearted guy and then the woman like wins his affection and it means more. So that's not what I mean, but there's something about this, like,
so
very,
that, but
like,
not that.
yeah, not that, because this is a bear and it's not romantic. But you know, he's not a human and he doesn't like process emotions in the same way that Lyra is accustomed or that we are. And there's a lot made about how stoic he is in a sense, and how, you know, the way of people, you know, we get that a lot of like, I'm a bear and this is the way that bears do things. And that's kind of it. So they're treating each other, and it's almost like on two different levels because they don't exactly express themselves the same way. But there comes a point where Lee Scoresby is talking about the bear and says something like, if bears could love, that bear loves that child. And I'm just like, he does, doesn't he?
He loves
That child.
But there's something meaningful about it because of the like differences of the way that they're expressing this.
I guess it also is saying how it's almost like a thing of childhood. Children can cut through that barrier that adults try to throw up. And Lyra cuts through his barriers and forms a connection with him when he doesn't really want connection with other people or with other beings because he's a bear.
Well, and because he's in like a really bleak place when Lyra comes along in his life.
Literally a drunk bear.
He's like literally a drunk murderer bear.
I also think, I mean, he could also be like toxic masculinity too. You know, like
What?
I think so. I mean, like with the bears, the male bears are the ones that are like in charge or whatever, and they don't feel like a man, like a bear, unless they have their armor, and then his armor gets taken away from him, and he's nothing without it.
I think the thing with the armor, though, is more so that, and I think it even says it in the book itself, is that the armor is like their soul. So it's, for the bears, the armor is like their daemon. So I don't know that I understand where you're coming from with that. I don't know that I fully agree with it, though.
I'm not sure if I agree with it either.
Yeah. I don't
It's just a thing I threw out there.
I don't know. I also think that the armor being their like spirit or whatever. I don't know. It was weird because they made a huge like disconnect between how humans like are born with theirs and the bears kind of create them. I guess we could talk about like the spirits and the demons and stuff like that, but
Sure, yes.
Yeah.
That's definitely a conversation to have here.
But yeah, I just thought it was, I don't know. I didn't know how to take that on a first read. I don't know how it goes with the rest of the series if the bears come back at all. But yeah, I don't know. It was just different because then the witches also don't have demons at all. Well, no, they do, but they don't have demons that are like have to stay with them.
Yes.
So I just think that the like different spirits are confusing a little bit.
The soul discourse, which like I'm having traumatic flashbacks to Buffy, just like saying those words. The second we start talking about souls and like how souls work and like what they mean, I was like, oh no, don't do it. I can't. But the like soul discourse in the books is definitely, I understand that as a point of disconnect with the story where like you're wanting, you know, something more concrete. I think I think that is probably especially true for people who read a lot of like high fantasy. It is never something that has stood out to me or bothered me at any great length, but I get what you're saying. And like, yes.
I'm trying to think if, I don't think that the soul thing bothered me here. Obviously, it bothered us very much in Buffy because we brought that up first. But I think that the Buffy discrepancies, it happened from like person to person and episode to episode. Like, this is what the soul means. No, just kidding. It means something else. Whereas here, there seem to be different iterations of souls, but they kind of stay consistent. So in Lyra's world, it is the external soul in the form of an animal. We see that for the bears, it is, you know, in their armor. For the witches, it is also a demon, but one that, you know, because of whatever their power is or the way that they experience the world, these these demons can kind of be further away from the witches. And then later on in the series, we see different iterations as well. So that part doesn't really bother me because, what is a soul? I don't know. Ask me. I don't have any other better idea than Philip Pullman does with his adorable animal souls. Like that's as good as it gets for me too, Philip Pullman. So that kind of like variation doesn't bother me as much as like when in Buffy, it was like, no, you got to earn a soul in a cave with a motorcycle or whatever the hell happens later on in the series.
I guess with also like with you guys saying this, it's kind of like moving my opinion away from what I was thinking before, because the series does talk about, well, I was saying I have mixed feelings, so I was really going to use this as like my way of reviewing this book.
I'm so happy.
Well, because I guess also like with what you guys are saying, they do say in the book how the soul of children, like how the external animal soul of the normal people like starts to settle as they become adults, and how as children it's malleable, but once it becomes an adult, there's that one guy that's explaining the souls and how the shape that your soul decides to take or your demon takes like really reflects who you are. And I think that I guess for like the bears, it could be that they are able to like reinvent themselves completely from what they've been before. So like Yorick was this very like angry bear that could be baited into attacking another bear, and I think at the end of the series with his new armor and his new life, he is not the same bear that he was before. So maybe that's like a thing.
It's also something of like to this idea of like the creatures being different creatures. I had never really thought about it in this way, but that's a really interesting point, because you see it's sort of a way of saying that like the soul is an act of creation for the bears, like that they make their armor, and like that part of what defines the bears as like beings is that they are engaged in that kind of like creation in a like, I don't know, soul deep sort of way.
Then the bears are described a lot as solitary animals as well. And so part of what Lyra talks about with her demon and her soul is that there's always that sense of companionship. So that expression of a soul like really fits who humans are, I think. And then like the bear one is like, we're born alone into this world, and what we have we make, and it is a part of them, but not in a way that there's like a constant companion, right? Like it still kind of forms around that idea of a bear being a solitary being. So it fits to each character.
And the witches also like are explained that way too. They're so confident, they're so, I don't know, just happy with where they are and what they're doing, that they are okay with their souls, like, or their demons going far away from them. They feel confident and then that happening.
I think the world in general that has been created here, it's part of the reason that I love these books. The characters in the world are like my two favorite things, but there's something really interesting about having a world that seems familiar but isn't quite our world. And there's a lot of, and the way that Pullman builds the world is super interesting. I read it as slow the first time around, probably the second time around, but I really, really appreciated this time the way that he fed you the world in pieces. And he is the type of world builder that will just say a word, like put a term out there without the need to stop and be like, this means this. Like he just lays it out, lets you pick up on context, and it slowly builds around you so that by the time you're getting, you're in the middle of the book, you're in towards the end, you feel like you've kind of melted into this world and you're accepting things as they come, from like the Anbaric lights and the Zeppelin. A Zeppelin shows up and you're like, of course there's a Zeppelin. It's beautiful. And it's like a little steampunky, but it's got like parallel universes. It's just a really great setting. And I think that maybe I didn't appreciate that as much before this read.
That is also something that I super love about these books and the way that they are written. This is something I complained about a lot when we were reading the A Song of Ice and Fire novels, just how much time George R.R. Martin spent like explaining the world to us. Like as much as I love all of like the detail and the richness, and I think that that's really impressive and incredible, like what he built, it was frustrating to have the story told to me in that way. And it is something that I really, really love and appreciate in these books. Not that I need to explain that by way of comparison. Whatever, I did it. I love the fact that we learn all of these things in ways that feel very naturalistic. Like the demon thing isn't explained to us in a way that feels unnatural. You know, like all of the pieces of the world that we are given in ways that fit for the characters. And you said something earlier about how Lyra's world starts out very small, and then like we get to see her in more and more of the world. And that's a big part of how the reader gets to learn more about the world, is by making Lyra super sheltered to begin with. She then has so much to learn, and because she has so much to learn, we are able to learn along with her, and like then we end up learning the details of the world in a way that doesn't ever feel like aggressively showy. Something that I kind of wanted to touch on that stood out to me in this reread, but I have my thoughts are sort of half formed, so like bear with me as I try to figure out how to ask this, especially because some of my thoughts are things that are kind of wrapped up in where the story is going, like long term, and so I'm trying to figure out how much of this exists specifically in this book. But I think something that is big throughout the series is this idea of like there are a couple of things that stand out in particular. So the man who's explaining why demons settle to Lyra, that he's the man on the ship who talks about, you know, what if your demon is something that you don't want it to be? And he's like, well, then you're like discontented, and then you like live your whole life that way, resisting who you are, but it is who you are. And later, Serafina Pekkala says something about kind of very much along those same lines, like we cannot change what we are, we can only change what we do. And I think those themes are really, really big and present. I think the biggest place that we see that in this book is with Jofor Rignason and his basically trying to resist his nature as a bear, and like that ultimately being his undoing is that he stops acting like a bear, and so he is able to be tricked unlike a bear, and that is what gets him killed in the end. And I don't entirely know where I'm going with this, except that I think that this is interesting, and I picked up on those themes a lot more this time around than I have in the past. I don't know. I think it's interesting. ? I
think another thing that I find interesting as well, sort of going off of what you were just saying here, is I find it interesting that Lyra and Yorick are both very, particularly near the beginning, a little bit less so a little bit further on, but they're very black and white. They see the world as, you know, well, I'm right and you're wrong, or this is how things are done, and this is good, this is bad. And I like that they sort of have the same thought process that way. And I think that as things go on, they're able to, like, as Lyra goes out further into the world, she has those horizons broadened, and she does see that, you know, it's not just good and bad. There are aspects of gray in there too.
Mm-hmm. Connor mentioned earlier about like the ending, and I also, because we were doing this as a group read, Jess, who has been on the podcast, all read along with us, and she was so upset by the dark themes of the book, and she sent so many angry messages at me through the course of her reading, and then especially at the end. I think one, because she wasn't expecting the darkness, but there are like a lot of dark themes here, and the book doesn't treat its children particularly well. And then it goes through all of the lengths of introducing these like external souls and the demons and endearing us to that, and then making the main like violent action being separating children from essentially their souls. And so for a lot of this, I also was super upset, even knowing the ending and where we're going. Not that any of the series is like particularly bright and happy. It is definitely dealing with darker themes, but I was having visceral reactions to all of this as well, but particularly how grown-ups could be doing this to children. And I think that it's, as I get older, it makes me more upset. And I think in this context of 2019 and some of the things that we've seen in like politics and in news over the last few years, like that has made me particularly upset. But in trying to like frame the motivation and what is happening here, I think that theme of like rallying against yourself is really important to the whole idea of dust and how, you know, they may not know exactly what's happening, but they know the progression of things. You know, you have your demon, it settles, and dust becomes like a larger presence for the adults. And these people are refusing to accept that for whatever reason, to the point where they are comfortable kidnapping children and essentially killing them when they're separating from the souls because of that like bullheaded kind of, you know, commitment to taking a thing that is fact, that is happening, and trying to change it. And I think that that is very much in line with that theme of like rallying against yourself or against things that are true, to the point where we have these horrible monsters in the form of adults in the story.
Yes.
That's a lot to like.
Yeah. There's a lot, but that's it. That is the conclusion that I was desperately reaching for. There it is. I'm scrolling through on this read. For this reread, I went to once again reopen my well-worn paperbacks, which were secondhand when I bought them in the first place and are now like literally like I opened the book and it was falling apart. So I bought the book on Kindle. It's my third time purchasing this book. So while I was reading it, I was highlighting a bunch of things this time around. And it's like, it's fun because I'm like, ooh, now I have access to all my highlights and I'm scrolling through them. And this is like not actually an important thing, but I was scrolling through my highlights. And one of the things that I highlighted is the bit where where she and Roger get drunk in the college. And they're like, yeah, this is like, I like feel like garbage. And Roger's like, I feel like garbage. I don't understand. Like, do adults actually like this? And Lyra says, yes, in the same condition. And so do I, she added stubbornly. And I was like, wow, that's a whole mood. That
me every single time I drink. Do I like this? Yes, I do, damn it.
You can't tell me I don't.
This is not a book that has very many moments of levity, but they come in clutch when they exist. Yes.
I'm like still trying to think of like how you guys were talking about fighting against yourself and everything like that. I don't know if this happens or not. Does Lyra's demon refuse to settle for a really long time?
No.
Okay. Because during the series, she's like, I don't want it to settle, like all this stuff. And I was thinking that maybe like she doesn't know, like she's not sure of who she is. But then that doesn't work because her demon reflects who she is. And she just has to like accept whatever that is.
I think, I mean, in some of that, like, in some of her, like, refusing, like, never, 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 that's also a very, like, childhood thing.
Yes.
You know, even in little things like, you know, if you think boys or girls are gross and you think never, never, and then suddenly you're like, I don't know, they're kind of cool. You know, like things like that you look forward into what adulthood is. And there are a lot of times, God, I remember thinking things about my mother, who I love very much, but I would see some of her behaviors and think, I'll never, you know, do that. And then I do them now and I'm like, oh my God, I am my mother. So there's a lot of like
the inevitable.
Yeah, there's like a lot of rallying against like what it means to be an adult and who you'll be as an adult that happens for every child. And so I see a lot of that in when Lyra is saying, yeah, well, we'll never settle. It's more like, well, we'll never grow up. But again, that's sort of the kind of eventuality that you really can't fight against. It's going to happen.
One of the other things that I highlighted is when you're young, you do think that things last forever. Unfortunately, they don't.
Because that one guy that's explaining demon settling and everything like that, he's talking about that one guy whose demon settled as like a sea creature. I don't remember. Maybe it was a porpoise.
Yes.
And how the guy at first was like a little upset with what had happened, but then he realized that he was a seafaring guy and like he just couldn't be away from the sea. And then once he accepted who he was, then he was happy with his lot. But then that doesn't actually work all that well with some of the other characters, because as we were talking about with the dust settling and they're not accepting that dust is a thing and rejecting that, they cause all sorts of problems like Lord Asriel and Mrs. Coulter. like not accepting the people that they are and just like acting a different way. They're like trying to reject who they are. I don't know.
I think I also took their feelings on Dust less as we don't like being how we are and we want to still be able to change our demons and all that. I didn't really take it as that. I more so took it as we don't know what this Dust is. So since we don't know what it is and we can't explain it, it's bad and it shouldn't exist anymore. That was more so how I took it. And particularly with a lot of the themes in the book and the series as a whole, it does tackle sort of like a religious sort of mentality. And so I think that that is a big part of them, you know, not accepting Dust and wanting to destroy Dust is more so just, I don't understand it, so I don't like it, so it needs to not exist anymore.
I think that's definitely also part of it. They do explicitly say that at some point in the book. I think Lord Asriel is talking, like that's sort of his understanding of why the Magisterium wants to destroy Dust. And like that's definitely also a part of it. I think maybe, I don't know, I also feel like it can be both, you know, like both things can be true. It can both be an example of people rejecting like a part of their nature, like a part of like truth that they're not comfortable with. And also it can be true that it's a thing that they don't understand. And so therefore they seek to destroy it, which yes, 100% that is like a larger theme of the book, is that like, this is a bad way to be. Trying to destroy everything you don't understand is bad.
I have vague memories of this story from when I was young, but only because I wasn't allowed to read it. It's probably up there with like Harry Potter on the list of things that, you know, Christian people probably being raised in very religious homes didn't want you to read because they were bad. So it's really funny to me coming to this story now. And in the second book especially, I think some of these like anti-religion themes are a little clearer. But I have this is such a romp that most of the time, a romp is probably the wrong word because it's
it's a child murdering romp.
Yeah. Maybe pace. I don't know. It really, when the action shows up, it is very good. And it always like catches me a little off guard. And there's a moment, especially like as they're heading north, that Lyra's being constantly like recaptured or whatever. And they're just very well paced and very well thought out and very like visceral action sequences that I almost forget that piece of it is in here. But yeah, the idea of like the church as it exists in this world, wanting to so desperately get rid of sin that they would then kidnap and murder children is really funny to me. But I think that's probably like the main way that Philip Pullman starts to tackle the idea of like the church and sin bad and, you know, whatnot in these stories. But it's really that it almost becomes secondary to me in the presence of like everything else that he's introducing in this first book.
So this brings up in like a very roundabout way something else that I kind of wanted to talk about. I mentioned earlier, sort of like put a pin in the idea of like Lyra being inventive was the word that I used. Another word I would have used there is imaginative. The book explicitly makes a point of saying that she is not imaginative. Whatever. I'm bringing it up now in part because okay, long-winded spiel incoming, but it's part of sort of a larger thing that I find really interesting about these books, because I love these books with my whole heart. But also as J.K. Rowling is out here constantly like destroying Harry Potter for Harry Potter fans, I think about this in part because I have never had a particularly idealized notion of Philip Pullman. Like I don't know. I like my relationship. I've always had a very death of the author relationship with these books. And I think, I remember, Mari, when you were first starting to read them, I was super nervous because like, obviously, you know, like you have that much more religious background. And it's a thing that to me, I don't don't really read a ton into that because I think that there are a lot of ways you can read these books, but also like obviously it's there, right? Like that anti-religious sentiment is definitely there and it's in these books. And I'm not going to like fault anybody who is like, no, I feel slightly offended by this, you know, like that's legitimate and like a real reason to have a problem with these books. And I don't know, whatever. Like that's a relationship that I cannot speak to because I do not have it. And so it's like always a thing that I feel sort of like wary about and wishy-washy about. But so to this larger point about Philip Pullman and him not calling whatever, there's a bit in this book at the beginning of chapter 15 where he talks at length about, wait, hold on. I'm going to start this because I wrote about it in the Discord. So the opening of chapter 15 always bothers me because it feels just like super contradictory. And like the narration goes on about how Lyra has no imagination and that like being a practiced liar doesn't necessarily mean you have imagination. And like that's what gives their lies such wide-eyed conviction. And it seems to be suggesting that like imagination is only a trait of anxious people and that Lyra's optimism makes it impossible for her to be imaginative. I don't know. There's just like a bunch of ideas packed in there about like about what it means to be imaginative that I just fundamentally disagree with. And it's a thing that crops up a few times throughout the books where I feel like the narration is talking about Lyra in a way that maybe it's just because I love her so much and I'm super defensive that I'm like, no, you're wrong though. And like it, but it feeds this larger sense of, I don't know, I'm like conflating a lot of ideas all at once, but it feeds this part of my feelings about like my ambivalence towards Pullman and why I'm like, no, I love this world and like I love these books and I love these characters and like I'm going to do what I'm going to do with them and read them and interpret them in my own ways and like shrug to you. That was like a lot that I just laid out there. So all at once.
At the start of chapter 15, who's the person that's delivering those lines?
It's
like
the narration, the narrator.
Okay.
Yes. So yeah, Philip Pullman, basically.
Yeah.
Has Philip Pullman been, what am I trying to say?
J.K. Rowling on Twitter? No.
Yes. Has he been problematic on Twitter?
Yes. He recently said some like weirdly transphobic shit.
Yeah. He was like, I don't understand it.
Well, yeah. So like that was disappointing. But he has not been out there retconning his stuff on a whim. But like also yes.
Has anyone read the most recent, The Book of Dust?
I have not. I bought it as soon as it came out, but I haven't read it yet. I did this with the Veronica Mars movie too. I bought the Veronica Mars movie in the Kickstarter because I loved that show with my whole heart. But then I had a similar feeling of like, but I love this show and I own this movie, but I don't really need to watch it. I don't know. I don't care. And that's kind of how I feel like The Book of Dust.
You said that Philip Pullman wasn't out there like retconning his own work. And I was like, well, maybe there's a whole other.
That's true. There's also Lyra's Oxford, which came out quite some time ago, which is also, you know, sort of revisiting the world. But at least it's a little bit different. So that's more like cursed child level type stuff, which is people also have lots of feelings about, but is a slightly different thing, I think, than like what she's doing on Twitter. Mm-hmm. Here's a thought I had on the toilet. Stop. Stop.
That's a little different than here's a book that I wrote.
Right. Here's like an actual book. And yes.
I feel like you bring up so many things and then we're all just like, oh. Like you were bringing up religion and everything like that, and like just to bring it back to like mid thing that you were talking about. Like I was raised like super Catholic, which is not how I am anymore. But when I was reading it, I was like, oh wow, this is like really attacking some stuff that I would assume Catholic Church has done in the past. Like some things involving children, and stuff like that. So yeah, I was like, wow, this is like right at that core thing. So I like picked up on it straight away. But I don't know if like a regular person nowadays would. Like if a kid picked up this book nowadays, I don't know if they would like realize everything that was happening during the time that this was published. But as an adult, I was like, oh wow, this was happening right before this book got published. And this is probably like talking about this, and I was like, whoa, okay, cool, yeah, let's do that.
You have all the context for the things that this might be commentary on.
To that end, though, there are still pretty recent headlines about organized religion and what they've done to children. And, you know, kind of to my point from earlier, there's a scene here at Bolvangar where the demons are kept in cages, and the way that, you know, it's hard not to draw parallels to recent headlines about children kept in cages. And like that feeling of like, what monster would do this? And then you're like, oh, it's 2019. I know exactly what kind of monster would do this. So, you know, I feel like somebody picking this up now, like especially an older child, would have plenty of context for this book, different probably than you know 1995 or whenever this was first written and released. But there's still unfortunately context for child abuse. Yeah, essentially.
And I will say, like, I knew when I picked up the book about, like, the controversy surrounding it vis-a-vis religion. And for me, my read on it, honestly, it took me like several reads before I got to the point where I felt like I had a full context of like what is the most anti-religious way to read this, like to read the series. Because for me, when I first read it, I always took it as being more about institutions, you know, rather than like spirituality or yes, like being about bad faith institutions rather than like, you know, fuck religious people writ large.
Right, because the whole book and a main part of the book is about this idea of souls, which is like very tied into spirituality. Like to believe like there's like an essential point of being a person that is, you know, and then we're not just like a collection of molecules, I don't know, whatever, purely scientific thing. So there is a component of spirituality that Philip Pullman is buying into by feeding us a story. It definitely is this idea of like institutions and like the lengths that, or even like, I don't know, there's this idea of like when people come together in institutions, the way that kind of like group think almost dulls like the reality of what's happening. You see that a lot at Bolvangar, where everybody's like, come here, like the way that they're treating the children, and it almost like in the day-to-day task, it gets lost what these people are doing to the children. So yeah, I think that's true, that it's more like an institutional thing.
There are so many things in this novel that we could talk about. Like, I'm literally like, you were just talking about the institution, and I was like, yeah, and then there's the people that are at the institution that had their demons severed as adults, that were like, had this terrible procedure happen to them as adults, versus like the effect that it has on them and the children. It's like, it's so much worse on the children can't survive, and the humans, like the adults that it happens to, do survive. There's so many things.
There is so much to unpack with that too. That like it's super interesting, right? Because we have no idea like what level of, you know, coercion went into that or whatnot. But it's very possible that they went into this willingly. And like, I don't know, does that change the outcome of the thing? Like, is that part of how they were able to survive it? Whatever. Like, yes, there's totally a ton there that like the book doesn't ever address, but like leaves you to ponder about if you want to.
And I think that a big part of that, too, was if it may not have specifically been coercion, if they went into it thinking of, oh, this is for the good of the many versus the good of the few.
Yes. How bought into the ideas of the Oblation Board were they by the time that, you know, they had the procedure happen to them?
Right.
I'm going through all of my notes and stuff, and I know like we've been talking for quite a while, so it's like in theory time to start winding down. But I wanted to bring up something else that jumped out at me this time around about Lyra. Again, from kind of that same perspective of like, here's something that I noticed. Can we talk about it so I can figure out like how I feel about it / what it means to me? When Lyra is with the Egyptians on her way, shortly before she gets captured and taken to Bolvangar, she is thinking about Mrs. Coulter and how much she hates her. And in thinking about her, she thinks that like her primary reasons for hating Mrs. Coulter are the monkey, who Pantalaimon hates the monkey, and so like her soul hates Mrs. Coulter's soul, which is like wild as a thing that exists in this book. But then the like Lyra, Mrs. Coulter, like separating their souls, it's that that Mrs. Coulter had pried into her secrets. And I find that super fascinating because there are so many reasons that Lyra can hate Mrs. Coulter. And I find this, I don't know, this detail just jumped out at me because while if I were to make a list of all the reasons to hate Mrs. Coulter, this would this would not be one of the first things that came to mind, like Mrs. Coulter pried into her secrets. But I find this really interesting, just, that one, like this 11-year-old girl would have that thought. And like as a character revealing detail, like because this is something that doesn't jump out to me as a thing, therefore I read that as like being a very character specific thing,
As you're talking about it, I'm wondering how much of like that like betrayal of prying into her secrets comes from her sense of like diligence. So the master at the college tells her to keep it safe and not reveal it to anybody. And she is very like, she keeps it close. She takes care of it. And she's very like through thick and thin, she has this by her. And so I wonder how much of like Mrs. Coulter like prying into her secrets was her like, trying to protect that mission, and then like that is taken away from her, not by her own choice. You know what I mean? Like she was taking so much care, and she was like, I almost did the thing, and she continues to take a lot of good care of it past that point. But I can see why that registers as a like deep betrayal to Lyra.
To be clear, I actually the rest of that quote, I only read part of it, but like the rest of it was prying into her secrets, particularly that of the alethiometer. So yes, you're probably 100% right about that read.
I also think it's a little bit that Mrs. Coulter hasn't gained the right to be able to pry into those secrets, because Lyra doesn't seem, I mean, like, to me, she didn't seem like one that would be mad. Like, if Roger had gone in and, like, searched through her bag and figured some stuff out and was like, what is this alethiometer? I mean, he wouldn't know the name, but...
What is this compass?
Yeah.
Not a compass. I don't think that she would have been as mad if it was someone that she trusted. Like, if Lord Asriel or if the people at the college had, like, gone through her room or whatever, she would have been mad, but she wouldn't have been as mad because Mrs. Coulter didn't gain any amount of trust. She was like ordering Lyra to do these different things. And although Lyra at the beginning was very like in awe of Mrs. Coulter, Mrs. Coulter didn't really gain any trust with Lyra to allow like that much of prying into Lyra's personal life.
That's really interesting because later on when Lyra's with Lord Faw, and I forget, they make a pit stop somewhere to consult with someone who's kind of related to the witches. And so that person starts asking about the alethiometer. And I think it's actually Father Corm who starts to lie about it. Mm-hmm. But Lyra picks up something like between like the way that person's demon is acting and decides on the spot to be honest. And so that idea of like Lyra being repulsed by Mrs. Coulter's demon and then not having the trust there and not wanting to reveal her secrets. And we see that completely like contradicted when she meets somebody who some way that person's demon is acting, she feels more of like a reason to trust this person. Like their souls were not being repulsed. And then she comes clean at that moment. So it's not necessarily that she won't tell anybody. It's that specifically what Connor said, that Mrs. Coulter did not earn the right to be trusted or to like be let in on those secrets.
And it's almost one of those things where it's like you need to trust your instincts.
Which is like hardcore, big theme throughout this book. I have wanted an alethiometer tattoo for, the better part of the last decade. And there's specifically when the master is giving her the alethiometer, his like, he's rushed, so he doesn't have time to really talk to her or explain anything to her. His like parting bit of advice to her is keep your own counsel. And so like that, like in my head, like her having the alethiometer and like that advice is like very inextricably linked. And yes, like that, this idea of trusting your instincts / your, magical object is definitely like a big piece of this. And the alethiometer is part of how she learns to keep her own counsel, to, be her own entity and not purely place her faith and stock in, various adults around her. Like having this object is part of how she is able to become kind of her own independent being.
Can we talk about how much I love that Philip Pullman created this character who is a little liar, and he gave her a little truth reader that she can instinctively read, and she's the best at. Like, that's amazing.
I love it.
The like one thing I think that I want to touch on, I know this is like getting away from us. So, but I really think that we have, we have to talk about, a big theme here is also this idea. We talked a little bit about it in like rallying against yourself, but also the idea of like fate. And so Lyra is a chosen one, and there's a bit of prophecy kind of surrounding her about how she has to do a thing, but she cannot know that she's doing the thing, even though the thing is foretold. And so a lot of the tragedy of the end of this for me is, it's a very Hunger Games thing. Sorry if I'm spoiling the Hunger Games for you, but in the fact that like Katniss volunteers for Prim and then Prim dies. And so the idea that like this all kind of started for Lyra with like saving Roger, and then in the end, Roger dies. But more than that, the fact that Lyra brought Roger to her father, like she delivered him to her father, and like the heart punch that is to me, and her playing her role that other people know she must play but that she has to be ignorant about, I think is part of like the deep tragedy for me at the end.
I think the most upsetting part was when he was screaming for Lyra right at the end, as he's like screaming her name and then dies. Like,
I, in addition to reading this on Kindle, also have the audiobook and like listened to it while I was reading it. And yes, like having like a child voice shouting out Lyra right before he dies is like, it's a lot emotionally.
I listened to it on audiobook as well.
It's rough.
It was rough.
That sounds horrifying.
It is. The audiobook, to be fair, is like amazing. It's well edited. It's full cast. It's very good. But it does nothing to lessen the darkness of this.
It actually,
when you hear the children. Yeah.
It makes it more awful.
Yes. Because like periodically it's like children screaming and you're just like, oh, okay.
Oh, no. Stop.
And like when she's at this like facility, I can't remember the name of it. And like they take the one girl who like, who cares if you're reading the book, but like you hear the girl's voice and she's like, okay, I'll come with you. And I'm like, no, you're gonna die.
Yes.
You mentioned that this is like targeted as middle grade and that you would put it a little bit above that. And I 100% agree. I think that it's almost like it does a disservice to like falsely advertise this as middle grade because the themes are so dark that it almost takes a step above that. Not that, I don't know. Obviously, people read it as children. Sarah, you read it as a child. And so I think you can consume it on that level and maybe not understand it, and all of the different ways that you could as you grow up. But it is dark.
But I also, part of me feels like maybe there is a way of, making that an entry point into discussing things with kids. I one thing that I will say very much in like this book's favor is that I think it on the whole has it like respects children, in a like really big way. And I don't know. I think like that is the adults tasked with taking care of children will need to decide for themselves whether this book is too dark or like inappropriate for a child. But I think I don't know. I have mixed feelings about this. I agree with that general assessment of like, yes, this is very dark. Is it too dark for, a fifth grader? Sarah, I don't know.
I want to hear Sarah's opinion.
Yeah.
Sarah.
I mean, I think I turned out okay.
I am curious though, like how do you remember this sitting with you as particularly heavy as a kid? I don't know if you remember, but
not necessarily. I mean, it's very dark, and it wasn't like I read it and was like, oh, that was such a great happy book, like let me just read this with all my like it's obviously very dark, but I think that it also depends on the maturity level of the kid. Mm-hmm. I would say that it is definitely a book that shouldn't necessarily be, oh, let's just hand it out to anybody. But, if the kid is at a little bit more mature level, if they, are ready to be able to read and discuss some of this, I think that that's fine. I don't think that I picked up on everything that I do now reading it as an adult. I think as a child, I took it a little bit more literal. Like, for example, everything we were talking about before with mentioning the church and all that, I took it very literal as, oh, the church, not, you know, a reaction to things that are happening in real life with churches and organizations like that. So I think that it's definitely something that, depending on the maturity of the child, is fine, but should be sort of maybe discussed with afterward, or
Yes.
just to be able to kind of go through and break things down and make sure that they're okay, I guess.
Yeah. Processing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think one things that I would want to discuss with any child that read this is that whole death scene, because basically Lyra has been working this entire book, and she's like gone on this assumption that her love for her best friend is gonna like push her through and she's gonna save her friend, and then it doesn't work out. So it's almost like love is not the most powerful thing in the universe, which is true, but like for a kid that could be pretty devastating. So I think that you're right that for more mature readers it's probably fine, but like may want to touch base as people are
Check
reading
in.
it.
How you doing?
My concern, and to be clear, my concern is not necessarily like, will kids understand this, or the, you know, the main thing that I think about is like that this doesn't really step away from like the violence against children. And then for a child to be reading this, like I think about the Narnia books, and there were like wars and stuff in there, but it was all very like bloodless, right? And it didn't sit right in the middle of the action the way that this puts you right in the scene where Lyra is going to be severed from her demon, and puts you right in the death of Roger. And I feel like it seats you right in that violence against children, which is why I'm like hesitant to like, okay, you know, would you classify this kind of violence and these themes as middle grade? I'm not sure. But yes, whether or not a child could read this is entirely up to, you know, who that child is and who their caretakers are. I'm not trying to make any decisions there.
Right. Yeah.
And thinking back on, I mean, I don't remember a whole lot from the first time that I read it, but I think that since it was sort of otherworldly and it did have a little bit more of, oh, well, you know, this isn't really our world. These people aren't really like us. Having the demon be separate like that, I think made it easier, because it wasn't as obvious reading it as a child that like obviously you could kind of tell, like they say that these animals basically they are part of the people. And obviously, you know, with, I think it's Tony Marcos, you can see that it's a very destructive thing that happens, but I don't think that it for me at least, I don't think that it was as obvious of, you know, they're literally ripping this person's soul out.
Yes.
So I think that also played a part in it not being quite as hard-hitting as a child.
Yeah, not being able to fully make that connection in quite the same way.
Right.
Okay.
Darkness. Hello, darkness, my old friend.
All right. Well, I think this is going to do it for us. We've talked for quite a long time. Thank you to Connor and Sarah for joining us, and to all of you for listening. If you are enjoying this podcast, we would greatly appreciate it if you considered joining our community on Patreon at patreon.com/SnarkSquad. If you would like to join our book club discussions in the future, you can join our Discord, and more information about how to do that will be in the post dedicated to this episode at snarksquad.com. You can also find us on Twitter at snark_squad. I am at Sweeney Says.
You can find me at My Name is Marines.
You can find me at Connor Bookinit.
And I am at SarahLou92.
Thank you, as always, to Stefan Chin for the delightful theme music, and we will be back in your podcast feed again next week. Bye!
Bye.